Nobody owns a tall building? No? Okay. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings and additional correspondence received and sent? And we now move on to our main item of business, the second part of our investigation on housing typologies, specifically planning and tall buildings. Welcome to our first panel of guests. We are joined by Michael Ritchie, who is the place shaping manager at the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, Michael Forrester, who is the head of development management at the London Borough of Lewisham, Jessica Potter, the urban design lead on the Old Kent Road Regeneration at the London Borough of Southwark, and Colin Wilson, assistant who's been before us on many occasions, and with all sorts of hats on previously, who is the Assistant Director of Strategic Development and Old Kent Road Regeneration at the London Borough of Southwark. I'm going to launch my first question, if I may, because it's tradition that the chair does this and takes ages to find where he's started. There we go. I think both the London Plan Policy D9 has affected how your borough approaches planning and regulation of tall buildings. How has it affected those on Policy D9, perhaps? Mr. Forrester.
Thank you. So the London Plan sets the threshold at 6 stories 18 metres. But Part A allows local authorities to look at its own threshold, and Lewisham, in its own emerging local plan that's been through examination, sets a 10-storey threshold, or 32.8 metres. That's the output of detailed consideration and surveying of all building heights through a tall building study that informed the Regulation 18 local plan. So what the tall building study did, in essence, was review street heights in every single street, neighbourhood, and ward to look at prevailing heights, and overlaid that with a characterisation study that applied sensitivities such as conservation areas, views, listed buildings, etc., to give you a map of suitability. And that provided areas of tall buildings, which coincidentally overlay with opportunity areas, and gave you the sort of average height, which gave you the output of a tall building equaling 10 stories in the borough. So that will be different in other boroughs, but in Lewisham it was 10 stories.
So it's quite granular down to a ward basis. That's as granular as you get.
As ward is like ward, and then even like neighbourhood output, and then street output as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchie. What about the case of Tower Hamlets?
Yeah, so Tower Hamlets have taken a sort of a similar approach in having to do quite a lot of work at quite a granular level to understand what the impact of tall buildings would be in the borough. And so that D9 is very helpful, I think, in although it's quite broad and it allows each borough to interpret tall buildings sort of slightly differently by setting, as Michael has said, setting their own sort of definitions of what tall buildings would be. The introduction of a maximum height, requiring boroughs to state what the maximum height of tall buildings in a particular area would be, has been an interesting one, because Tower Hamlets' current local plan actually predates that requirement. So we were quite deep into the process of preparing a new plan when the new London plan was adopted, when D9 became a thing. So we don't currently have maximum heights in our current plan, although we do in our emerging one. And we have found that that's actually not, although it is helpful in some circumstances, because it kind of basically puts a cap on what the aspiration will be from developers for an area. It also, in some respects, provides a target for them to work towards. If they know that they can't go any higher than a certain level, then they probably will aim for that level. And so I think it has a kind of this interesting nuance where it does play out that way, that as soon as you put a number in a plan, people tend to fixate on that number a bit. What I found through experience of Tower Hamlets is that it's actually the thing that limits the height is a lot of other factors that we will take into account, impact on heritage, impact on the World Heritage Sites in particular has limited some of the heights in our tall building zones, but also daylight, sunlight, and kind of other amenity impacts. So. What I'm trying to say is, I think overall I don't really have any criticism of D9. I think it tends to work quite well. When you apply it locally, it kind of plays, different nuances play out in different boroughs. I would have thought. I think maybe in some boroughs that developers that height would be much lower, and developers wouldn't be sort of targeting much taller buildings, and a maximum height might be more useful.
So, is there anything absent from policy D9? Do you think?
Not that I can think of. I think it's a fairly comprehensive policy. I think it looks at tall buildings holistically. I think it works quite well in that respect.
Ms. Potter, what do you think about D9?
Yeah, so I think a similar approach was taken at Southwark as well, where we sort of defined it as being a tall building as 30 metres, so around that sort of 10-storey mark, typically located within like major town centres, opportunity areas, sort of central activity zones. They have based off of characterisation studies and protecting sort of main heritage assets, local views, obviously the London View Management Framework. Within the Old Kent Road, however, it's taken a little bit further. And where the Southwark Plan has a map that identifies possible locations, which I think is a real positive that's come out of D9, is actually showing where tall buildings should be located on a map. I think that's really key. It makes it a bit more accessible to understand a tall building policy. But the Old Kent Road Area Action Plan actually then goes into a bit more detail, looking at the opportunity area in detail, with the characterisation study backing it up. And we provide a stations and crossing strategy for the tall buildings, which indicates a 3-tier strategy. Tier 1 being our tallest with above 20 stories, marking sort of main new proposed tube stations or key crossings across Old Kent Road. And then you've got a tier 2, which is sort of between 16 and 20 stories, and then tier 3 up to 15 stories. And these are the sort of neighbourhood local landmarks, as you can see on the figure, kindly being demonstrated. There is a colour code to it. It makes it really legible, it's clear, that provides clarity. We've got a lot of landowners within the area, so it helps to provide that conversation at the early stages of pre-applications and then application stage. It also helps local residents actually understand where they live, what the impact is going to be on their area, and a little bit on scale. We just have really taken the policy in representing it in a 3-dimensional way, and that's between mapping and a 3D, as well as digital 3Ds like View City, and encouraging developers to provide us with 1 to 500 scaled foam models, which we found with residents have been a real good positive outcome, because they can, one, locate their own homes in some instances, and they can also understand what that impact is and the scale of these buildings that we're proposing.
You mentioned about different categories of tall buildings. Do you think that there could, perhaps in the new London plan, be additional distinctions of what's a tall building, a very tall building, a ridiculously tall building? Do we need that chopped up into different definitions?
I guess the London plan already does provide the flexibility for the boroughs to do that, because it does range across London, across the whole Greater London area. And what we would classify as a taller building may be different to the outer boroughs. So I think it does already provide that flexibility for each borough to do that. I mean, in our Southwark plan, we do say taller buildings and do describe them and break them down. Obviously, if you go sort of down into Dulwich, it would be a bit lower scaled. But all of them are, you don't just consider them in general on what heights. It is, again, like you said, the heritage aspects, the views, making sure that they're all taken into consideration, and the wider townscape impacts as well. We think that the range gives enough flexibility. So we're not just saying like you have to have something.
So I think it's fair to say all the guests here would support the retention of D9 in any future London plan. Is that fair to say? Yep, great. Let's move on to, I'm now going to ask Assembly Member Baker to ask the next question, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, so we've started, my questions, we're going to start on the sort of changes in local plans, sort of from what they were and around tall buildings into what they are now. And I don't think we've started talking about yet why you might have adapted those plans. Obviously, local plans get refreshed regularly, but what the reasons were for changing definitions, particularly. I wonder, Michael, could you answer? Can we kick off with Lewisham? So, what led Lewisham to make the decision to change some of the definitions, and also how you'd operate that?
I think for us, if you were to compare, I mean, Lewisham as a borough is very diverse. So you've got Blackheath to one area, very, very historic and low-rise. Largest Wardian suburbs, 2 stories.
Yes.
And then you've got pockets in major town centres such as Lewisham where it's not uncommon to see 35 stories.
Yes.
And the growth strategy that has been in place for quite some time has been to manage it towards major town centres, opportunity areas.
Yes.
That can only, those areas can only take so much development. So in the next version of the local plan that we're now taking through the sort of adoption process, where that other sort of district centres, so very, very accessible locations, Brockley, for example, could take more managed growth, but not introducing 20-storey buildings, 25-storey, because they would be inappropriate in townscape terms. So the whole idea for us was to introduce character-based policy that would require developers to really look at the contribution of that site in a place. And I think sharing some of the Tower Hamlets comments, we've had, so our new local plan does have the maximum storey heights in site allocations.
Yeah.
I think that's been useful to an extent, but also I think we've seen people go to the maximum limit as a sort of almost as a default, without necessarily doing that sort of design work and that design testing. But on the flip side, there could be a case for exceeding that that threshold. I watched the previous committee meeting of this investigation, and there was a panelist talking about a scheme in Lewisham where the site allocation referred to 11 stories, which is correct, but that's from a very sort of rough analysis and not detailed master plan. You can't do that in a local plan.
Yeah.
But what they were able to do as part of data design work and views testing and daylight and everything else is demonstrate a 15-storey building could be acceptable. I think what we would always try and challenge people introducing tall buildings is what is the narrative behind it rather than the rationale. So the narrative rather than the whole justification for it. So what's its contribution to place, and particularly in sort of more settled suburban areas, we would try and push for alternative typologies, so exploring mid-rise buildings. But I think even the term mid-rise, what you would associate a height for, has probably changed over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's probably 5 stories, it's now probably 10 stories, I think some people might say, and that would vary from borough to borough.
Yeah.
So, but in summary, we're pushing for sort of place-based growth as opposed to just blanket growth across the entire borough, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Tower Hamlets and Southwark, do you have any comments on sort of the reasons for any adjustments recently in your approach to tall buildings? Michael?
Yeah, if I could come in on that point. So we're quite far through our new local plan at the moment. We've just completed a Reg 19 consultation, and we've been looking at tall buildings as part of that, mainly just as looking at ways that we can respond to the real pressing need for housing in Tower Hamlets and ways to address serious overcrowding. Similar to other boroughs, in fact, in the past we have directed tall buildings towards specific areas where they are opportunity areas or major centres, Canary Wharf and Aldgate being in particular tall building zones historically in Tower Hamlets. But we're now looking at a sort of broader approach of having taller buildings, not the tallest, but a more permissive approach to taller buildings in more areas. Which is moving away from this idea where you would have 1 or 2 clusters of very big, very tall buildings, and moving away to the idea that you would have more dispersed, lower, sort of medium height tall buildings to kind of just to respond to the really pressing need for housing that we're facing.
Yeah. Again, can I ask you about that? So, it feels that a lot of the concerns that do arise in communities are when you quite quickly get and this I suppose is to everyone, but it arises from quite quickly get a cluster of tall buildings, and it may not simply be about that height, although the height, but it's the volume in a small space. So obviously you have talked about clustering in town centres and opportunity areas, but that certainly has quite that feels like a lot is changing over a lot period of time, and I think then density and numbers and impact on local services gets raised rather than necessarily just the height, and then the height is sort of a proxy for actually the concerns. So are those concerns something that has led to adaptations where you're saying, okay, well, we need the housing, but we're going to spread it out a bit and maybe not cluster so much? Is that part of it, or is it, to be honest, just that you've maxed out some of these areas and you have to look elsewhere? Yeah, Colin. Oh, no.
Okay. I think there is a bit of an issue with the way that planning documents communicate where tall buildings are going to go. And I would say that was an issue for both the London plan and local plans. So to some degree, I'm surprised that people are still surprised about tall buildings in London, because they've been happening for 25 years now. And, the 2004 London plan has influenced all our borough plans, and that basically said tall buildings should go in opportunity areas, in town centres and in accessible locations. So there's been a number of iterations of our plan and colleagues' plans which have followed that route. But I think if you are a resident of London and you are looking at the London plan, I have to say, if you're a resident of Southwark and you're looking at our borough plan, you would probably be a bit hard-pressed to figure out where necessarily tall buildings might be going. Yeah. Because the mapping isn't as explicit as perhaps as Jess was referring as to what we've done on the Old Kent Road. That was a very conscious decision about trying to show people where those tall buildings would be, and to engage with people in a debate about that. And kind of where they are is partly determined by where the sites are available to develop at a higher density. So Michael referenced site allocations. They are a search for sites to deliver housing on. So there isn't a sort of free hand as to where development can go. I mean, it's partly determined where the sites are available. I think the communication issue is quite a fundamental one. I mean, I've met plenty of residents who've never heard of a development plan, and simply asked the question, why is this office going here? Why is this housing going here? If you love your home and the area you live, significant change in it is quite a challenging thing to have to contemplate. And I suppose it's all our jobs to try and communicate where that might be as clearly as we can. And sometimes that can be very simple things, maps, diagrams, digital and physical models. We found to be really helpful. And we repeatedly get asked about where the doctors will be, what's the demand for schools. So a function of planning is not just, well, there's some tall buildings over here, but here are the other things which support that. The balance is trying to communicate that without overwhelming people with masses and masses of information.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come on that?
Well, just actually, if I may, just very quickly on that, the sort of consultation point and how sometimes it acts as a surprise to people. And I completely see that, and I totally agree. And I think it speaks to a kind of, there's a sort of fundamental challenge for planning there, in that it's very difficult for the general public to engage with the planning process in the abstract. So let's talk about locations for tall buildings, and abstract heights that they might be. What they will respond to is when you show them a picture of a tall building and say that's going to be built at the end of your street, and then they will engage with the process. in many respects, it's a bit too late by that point because the strategic planning has already happened and the locations have been decided, and D9 has directed us towards a maximum height. And we worked very hard to try to find ways to unpick that problem and get engagement earlier on. And all sorts of different techniques have been used, and we've had varied success. But it remains a challenge to sort of engage people at early plan making stages. And
my next question was going to be, so there's a community development panel on the Isle of Dogs in South Poplar. So can you explain at what stage that sort of kicks in and how you've used that in terms of engagement?
Yeah, so it operates. I believe it can kick in to kind of the planning application stage mainly. Yes. So it's actually talking about schemes that are being proposed.
Yes.
So they might be in pre-app discussions with the council, and it operates as a kind of like we have almost now like a two-stage design review process. So we have a quality review panel, so an architect's design review panel, and also for schemes on the Isle of Dogs, they will go to the community panel as well. And they kind of have to, that's a kind of gatekeeping process that the schemes have to go through. But the real challenge would be to get the community, to expand that panel to cover a larger geographical area, but also try to engage it earlier on in the process and have them, again, they're very good at responding to what we're proposing, or a tall building is being proposed on the Isle of Dogs. Let's talk about how tall it will be, what the cladding will look like, what facilities it will provide at ground floor. But the kind of the stage before that of like the more strategic level ability is still difficult to tap into people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just specifically on that panel, do you have any examples of things that have changed in developments through feedback from that panel?
I'm afraid I don't. Because I'm not closely involved with their work. I'm more actually manage the other part of it, the design review part of it. But I could ask the people that manage it, and we could.
I think that would be really useful just for us to sort of see the sort of here's a bit of feedback, and in response to that, these are some of the things that change, so we can sort of see that practical application. That would be great. Yes, I was expecting something to want to come in here.
Yeah, hi. So you might be aware already, but in the Old Kent Road area, we also have a community review panel, which similarly acts as a sort of double review. We have the design review panel, but we do expect them at pre-app stage to attend the community review panel as early as possible, have that early review, and then once they've submitted the application, to return. So we want it to be a bit more of they can take their comments on board and show the development of what they've changed or what they've amended from those comments. So they do get an early stage review and a later stage, and sometimes we have seen it where they'll go a couple of times if there's been sort of outstanding problems that they've addressed. It's a very engaging panel. They do all like to get involved. We encourage that we take boards and presentations and sort of notes and everything. There are some instances where they've taken on board and actually amended the sort of shape and the proportions of the tall building due to the comments that were received on the panel. I think some of them, particularly along Ilderton Road, they were concerned about the longer views and how wide it was looking. So they sort of split it down and broke up the typology into a more slender profile, which was then very well received by the panel. So we found it's a really good positive part of the sort of new review, and also we find developers find it really helpful as well, because they're sort of actively getting comments from people that are living in the area, working in the area.
Thank you, that's helpful. And before I hand back, I'll just go back to my initial question around sort of changes that have happened in local planning. So we focused very much on the height, and obviously there are other aspects of tall buildings, which is the density, the proximity to each other, green space or lack of it. Are there any other aspects of the plan, the local plan, that you have adapted around the impact of tall buildings that aren't simply about the height? Thanks.
There's a couple of things that sort of come to mind. One is it's linked to the height, but it's around the issue of sort of coalescing of buildings, which isn't necessarily up to one person. It's always about the sort of group.
Yeah.
I think it's not explicitly referenced in D9, but we spend a lot of time, particularly sort of, at pre-app stage and with sort of GLA sort of planning colleagues, trying to refine the it's not the visibility, because they are visible, but it's their shape and their orientation, and trying to create that sort of varied skyline to stop big blocks of buildings at all the same height.
I suppose I'm thinking more of the people who are going to end up living there.
Yeah.
And, you know, the height itself isn't necessarily, you know, the thing that will affect their living there. It is how many other blocks are close by. Are you overlooked? Is there space around it and everything like that? So some of the other things that happen when you build clusters of tall buildings. And so is there anything that you've considered over time and sort of gone, okay, well, here's some drawbacks that we have found by sort of large clusters of tall buildings in town centres, opportunity areas. So we are going to sort of adjust that in our local plan in future.
So we spend a lot of time. It's really at pre-app stage, because by the time you spend an application, it's far too late.
Yeah.
But if you're proposing sort of public run and play space, not presuming it's rooftop, so, you know, 20 plus stories.
Yeah.
But trying to encourage ground floor where possible, and that's in sunlight for one. So we spent a bit of time looking at older developments that have been built, stuff that's shaded or secluded almost isn't used.
Yeah.
But we've got a sort of newer issue around, there's the tall building, but it's what's inside the tall building.
Yeah.
Because they're typically not just residential anymore, so it's lots of student accommodation, co-living accommodation, and that brings new challenges around what those occupants need.
Yeah.
And that's changing how some of the ground floors work. And I think we're probably still grappling with that, I would say, in London.
Yeah, I think we're going to come back onto some of these subjects there, so I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Bailey. But don't ask your next question, which you're scheduled to do. I know you wanted to come in on this particular thing. It's just that there are other Assembly members who also wanted to intervene at this point. And then
I understand now, Chair. Thank you. Morning to the panel. Colin, I want to come back to something you said about people asking why. Do people ask that less or more now, because Londoners are all very aware of the housing need? They live it every day. Do you receive that challenge less or more than you would in the past?
That depends, I think, on proven delivery. So certainly in the Old Kent Road, we had a lot of conversations with local residents about they don't particularly like the idea of tall buildings, but they would accept those tall buildings if they brought the public benefits of affordable housing, open space, play space, the things that somebody, Member Baker, referred to. There's an element of trust. So we were told, well, we don't trust you, the council, to deliver those things because we don't think you necessarily hold developers to deliver that affordable housing. So one of the things we've set out to do is to audit that delivery against our plan. So we have an audit of affordable housing delivery in the Old Kent Road, which is quite detailed about 1, 2, 3 beds, how much affordable is being provided, how much workspace and open space is being provided. And the response to that has been very positive. Okay. So there is less objection to tall buildings because we can show that we're directly affecting, for instance, our local housing waiting list, that we are improving the environment in a very deprived and run-down area, and we are investing in local services from SIL and Section 106 monies. So you can appreciate why people are
absolutely
doubtful about these things, and the quid pro quo is that public good that they can deliver.
I have another question. I'll come back when I have my other question. Thank you.
Assembly Member Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I think picking up on something, Michael Ritchie, that you said, and it's a challenge that I think we've probably all seen in the role that we have as elected members, and certainly when I was a councillor, and for the brief time that I was Cabinet Member for Planning, I saw it from not just members of the public, but also from fellow councillors, that the difficulties of getting people engaged at an early enough stage, at the site allocations or developing policy, most people will only notice and therefore get kind of exercised when there's a live planning application in front of them. With that in mind, both with the panel that you have in Tower Hamlets and the panel in Southwark, How do you try and manage expectations when people are getting involved at this stage, and try and kind of smooth those expectations and point to actually those, where they can have a meaningful input and change and amend and tweak things, but fundamentally without giving a platform just to object in the first place. You have to accept that some development is going to happen. It's how you shape it, but how do you get people to buy into that process rather than just wanting to say no?
I guess the answer really is to try to speak to people in terms of the way that they can, try to help them understand the way that they can influence the process. And sometimes that might be, and it might be a bit uncomfortable to sort of people to understand this, but it's sometimes decisions have already been made but also we're delivering housing because of a wider need, and therefore certain decisions have been made to kind of like beyond kind of local consultation, because those decisions had to be made in order to respond to the very pressing need for housing that we have. But there are things that can be done to explain to people, well, you do have some say in let's talk about the way that this development will manifest itself, and the way that it will, the way that it'll influence your life. It's quite tricky, because I think there's lots and lots of voices in that conversation. So you have the local planning authority officers, you have design review panels, you have sustainability experts telling you that you can and can't do certain things. You have, and then if you add in a community voice, it's the real challenge is how you sort of reconcile all of those different voices. And developers will tell you, well, it's just not possible to listen to everybody because we're constrained by so many factors. And my worry would be that the community voice would be, that the sort of non-professional voice would be the last one that was responded to, which I definitely don't think should be the case. So I don't really have a kind of clear answer about how, a definite answer about how this can be done. It's something local authorities need to work hard at, and something we are actively trying to address. It is challenging. One of the things we have done at the plan making stage, and I find is not necessarily through, obviously panels and forums are very useful because people are already organised and they know each other and they're kind of like meeting regularly. But if you want to tap into kind of people that might not be part of a panel or whatever, we found that you can have a consultation and you can book a room and you can invite people to come. People might not come. The thing you need to do is to go to where the people are already, so they're already having some other meeting or doing something about something else, and you go and talk to them at that. So, for example, when we have prepared guidance for high density living, so an SPD that talks about how people should, how you could successfully design tall buildings for people to live in. We did a lot of work there trying to go and talk to people in their homes, or just going to the play spaces where the children were playing nearby and talking to the parents there, and sort of just trying to catch these people in their natural environment rather than expecting them to come to us. I think that's a really big part of it.
Just to come in on that as well, our community review panel does actually review our strategies. So the area action plan has been to the community review panel. They've looked at our land use plans, our greener belt strategy, everything that works in hand with the tall building strategy. They all go together in where are the schools going to be provided, where are the community buildings going to be provided, where are the parks, how are we greening the streets, and what is the place and the sense of place going to be like. So I think they then they had an input into the strategies, and then they also become quite familiar with those strategies. So when things are coming, you almost avoid those high-level questions of, oh, is there a tall building here? They know that, yes, there is a tall building here. What we actually want to see is that workspace that you're co-locating with this efficient? And are these residential homes high quality? And what does the design look like? So then they start getting into the more detail, and we find that that's been really quite effective.
Thank you. And now to Assembly Member Bailey for your question.
Before I go into my question, just to bottom out this conversation, I come from 38 years of youth and community work, and one of the features of consultation is the usual suspects. So how do you negate the usual suspects, particularly as the people in the most need are the least likely to turn up?
We have the benefit in Select of Select Young Advisors, and that gives us a great connection with young people. We had a whole series of sessions about the plan in the Old Kent Road, and Select Young Advisors turned up and said it would be nice if we could have somewhere where we could have free Wi-Fi and tea and coffee to go to. You have all sorts of conversations about very elaborate things, and actually when you ask people, what they would like. It's often something very simple, which we are now providing. In the community review panel, the interesting thing about that was that it was selected for a mix of ages, gender, race, and business and residential community. You couldn't be on it if you were an architect or a town planner. So you know, we didn't want that kind of voice, because we have plenty of that. And it introduced a bunch of people to that conversation who weren't, as you described them, the usual suspects. And that has been really beneficial, to have that different view. It is difficult to absolutely to get younger people in particular to kind of engage in conversations. Tenants residents associations tend to be kind of older people. They're very active. But getting younger people kind of engaged in a conversation about planning can be quite difficult.
Yeah. I like I say, I've experienced that. I make a plea for the people who are not even in that community yet. Because one of the things about providing housing in London, you're effectively building communities that don't even exist, but they don't have a voice in the conversation. I don't have an answer for that. I just pose that as a challenge, and I'll stop there. What role do taller buildings play in meeting London's housing crisis in your borough? If I start with Michael, in your particular borough, what role do they play?
So we have a number of schemes delivering, genuinely high numbers of housing. We've been able to achieve good quantities of affordable housing for the most part, and that's been directly at a range of tenures. So the first being sort of target rent, social rent, but particularly in Lewisham Town Centre, there's a large pocket of population who don't qualify for that.
Yes.
That level of rent. So there's been interventions through London Living Rent, so council schemes promoting that to try and address a different bit of that. So that's been something that we've been doing. What we're now seeing are large quantums of student housing and co-living housing coming forward. But what concerns me the most about that are we're seeing residential permissions that have, they've got permission, they could be on site, but developers wanting to come back and convert those to student housing. So that's a real live issue for us at the moment, and we're sort of grappling with the change in market.
Yeah.
Because that's a very, very market-driven impact.
Yeah.
And we're having to sort of push back, saying, actually, well, what about, your residential units here? That was serving a particular purpose. And that is probably an everyday issue for us at the moment, I think.
Yeah. I didn't two Michaels. I now see why your eyes glinted when I said Michael. Please, Michael Ritchie.
I think you've actually a very similar response to the other Michael. I think tall buildings, they do play a big role in delivering housing in Tower Hamlets. We're very clear that they shouldn't be the only part of housing delivery. So tall buildings, they're helping to deliver lots of homes on, when you have a limited land supply in a place like Tower Hamlets, we're kind of running out of new sites that can be developed readily. Tall buildings do need to play a role in providing housing. But we do need to be clear that we're not going to provide all of our housing, or we shouldn't be providing all of it in tall buildings. Similarly to Lewisham, we are experiencing large numbers of proposals for student living, student accommodation and co-living. And I guess part of the rationale behind that is people will say to us, well, if we provide that kind of accommodation for younger people or people that are less, maybe family-oriented or whatever, then in tall buildings, then you're freeing up the lower-rise houses for the families. And I can see that argument. I think there's not enough evidence to say at the moment that is definitely what's happening. We need to kind of really sort of draw down to that and understand how that's playing out. What we don't want to see in Tower Hamlets, and what we're actively working to try to stop, is having just a sea of kind of student accommodation towers, and just because that's the easy thing for people to develop, because it's modular, it's quicker to build, the standards are more the same, and I think maybe the amenity standards will be less for students. You don't need to provide as much space, you don't need to provide an external amenity space. That daylight and sunlight standards would be lower. So we're quite clear that what we want to build in Tower Hamlets is homes for people rather than for people like families to live in, and tall buildings can play a role in that, but it's not the only part of it, I'd say.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you next, Jessica, but I'm going to add something to your question, so because I think the two Michaels really nailed it just there. What type of housing is more or less suitable for tall buildings? So there is a tension there. Both the Michaels talked about the tension that people want to give student accommodation because it frees up space or whatever. Fine, even if you accept that or not. But Michael also made a comment that maybe putting families in those situations might be tougher. So what kind of, in your mind, in your borough, and I'll come to you as well, Colin, afterwards, what do you think tall buildings are appropriate for, bearing in mind that almost every city in the world is growing, numbers-wise?
Thank you. I think that there is a range in the market, and we do have sort of residents in the tall buildings. We have students with co-living schemes coming forward, so we have got a range across. What is the key thing is we're delivering the 35% affordable homes. I mean, actually in Old Kent Road we're delivering 51% of affordable homes. We've got tenant associations, housing associations, taking on tall buildings because residents are getting sort of 1, 2, 3 bed good sized mixed flats, which are sort of moving out of overcrowded housing into large flats with nice balconies and good amenity courtyards with play space that we sort of scrutinise to make sure that they have that range of sand and water play and really engaging play space within courtyard spaces. So yes, the market is obviously challenging, but whilst we're seeing co-living schemes coming forward and student schemes coming forward, we're also making sure that we're still getting the affordable housing delivery, whether that is on site or on another site that they own within the area. Right. So it is just making sure that we're still delivering sort of those high quality homes. I think, as the sort of London plan says, it is that sort of balanced and mixed communities and making sure that you have a range of typologies to deliver that within our sort of Tustin estate regeneration. We're not only just looking at the high-rise, which for homes, we've got the low-rise houses are being refurbished, we've got the mid-rise developments just being rebuilt, and then we've got high-rise towers as well. And the tenants associations are really happy with living in those towers, and they have reflected that they enjoy that. They've lived in flatted apartments before, so they would like to stay. And they're more concerned about making sure that they have the space and the quality that they wanted. So that's what we try to focus on. Is that
space in their actual dwelling or around the building or both?
In their dwelling mostly, so like storage spaces and room sizes and things like that. But again, we've got a plan that shows where public spaces are going to be proposed, large open spaces, and so connections towards that, as well as ensuring that we've got an Aldi scheme, for example, which is Aldi supermarket at ground, co-located with a social rented flats above, and so they've got active ground floor as well as access to their homes and balconies.
Okay, Colin, answer any part of this, but add the two things I'm going to add to you is the utility of a tall building to families is that I think I'd be safe in saying much of the committee don't like the idea of tall buildings, and certainly where it pertains to families. And I'd like to hear your take on that. You know.
In terms of the typology, like the form of building we have, and I'm sure both Michaels have the same experience. If you're aiming for 35% affordable housing, then 35% of the volume of a development is going to be that affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So the remainder will either be private sale or more recently student or co-living. So in Southwark, you still have to generally provide the affordable housing on the site if you're doing co-living or student. So developers are swapping out those uses. So the affordable tends to be in the lower-rise blocks. The towers have either had private sale in them, or now they have student, or they have co-living in them. The kind of mid-rise element of any development, so the taller bit will be the 65%. The shorter bit will tend to be the 35%. Most of the family accommodation will be in the affordable. There will be some in the private. There won't be any in student or co-living. Goes to the point about mixed and inclusive communities. What all of us are trying to do, and our members are keen for us to do, is to find that balance within any one area. But the flats in those affordable tend to be mid-rise developments. where you have a 3-bed flat with a generous balcony, a decent communal space, which is, our requirements, I'm sure it is colleagues' requirements as well, and where you have a plan that sets out where new public open spaces will be, and where contributions will be made to existing spaces. So developers contribute to improving our existing parks. Then they can be great places for families to live. I mean, I've personally been involved with discussions with people moving out of low-rise, 2-storey, 1-bed house in the Old Kent Road into a flat, which is 3 beds, which I've been to have a look at. Lovely flat, great outside balcony, lovely communal space. The reason I got involved in the conversation with that resident who was on our housing waiting list because they were in overcrowded accommodation is because they were very desperate to get their keys to move in, and our housing department were being a bit slow about handing them over. So I don't think there's a problem with having families in taller buildings.
Interesting.
But it tends not to be the tallest because that's either private sale or student or co-living.
Weren't they desperate to move out rather than desperate to move in? From what you're saying, they were in 1 bedroom and they got 3 bedrooms. We've heard evidence before from a whole range of people that tall buildings just aren't suitable for families, but you're saying that they can be.
Yes, I think where they're carefully designed and GLA guidance on design on residential design has been around now for 15 years, and where the communal and private amenity being provided is well designed. I think the critical thing about people moving in, so the experience in both Canada Water and Old Kent Road, if you think of people moving in off our housing waiting list into the local area, they don't have to move school, they don't have to move their GP, they don't have to move their job. Rather than move somebody to a home in Hastings, their support network is maintained. It has less impact on the NHS, on our social services. I mean, there are so many massive benefits, I think, to providing well-designed housing at a relatively high density in places where people live, where there is a tremendous, housing waiting list issue.
Thank you, Mike. You Colin, excuse me. You reflect my own personal gains on, because I went from a tiny 1-bed with my 2 children into a 2-bed. It was on a 5th floor, but it was just bigger inside, and that made it better. And actually, what really made it work was the fact that the lifts worked. They had a good maintenance contract. The whole time we were there, the 7 years, I think the lift broke down once. So you could go up and down quite easily, and the communal space was safe. That was a key thing. It was safe. And I don't want to bore you with my life story, but it was safe. My last question would be, are you all having to respond to the realities of the market? You talked about, Jessica, having to provide housing elsewhere in the borough in order to make it work here. You talked about your challenge between student being...
I think that's probably quite fair to say, because it's one, you've got we've got high housing figures to achieve. That's just the way it is, and it's trying to put that in the most appropriate places. I think developers understand that, and for the most part want to deliver that. But really, it's the last few years of interest rates, inflation, so on and so on, that have seen changes to how they deliver. And part of it is you can deliver student housing much easier with the 2-staircase thing, but then some residential developers pulling away from that market. So, for example, Lendlease leaving the UK market, being replaced by other people. So it's much more, probably a bit more volatile than I would say it is compared to, say, 10 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Chair?
Thank you very much. Can I ask members to keep the pace up? We're just running a few minutes behind time. Assembly Member Carver.
Thank you, and thanks for all your responses so far. It's really interesting. Just to build on, well, it picks up on the lift comment that was just made. We've talked a bit about affordability, but I just wondered if you could speak to how tall buildings, if they do, help deliver your accessibility targets as well, because obviously there's accessibility targets in the plan, and we have a great need for accessible housing. I just wondered if tall buildings contribute to that. at all, and that's considered in planning? I don't know. Yeah, who wanted to start? Yeah.
Again, it's another part of an issue. So all units have to meet the sort of building regulations standards, the right lift specification and so on. There is, I think, a tension for me between truly accessible housing and if that's on the 18th floor, if that's workable. So we have a bit of an issue around, so working with our occupational health team, they'll sort of comment on the comment on plans of those units, and there is a request from them typically that those units are on ground floor with the parking space next door. But the reality is in a town centre where you've got to deliver a new shop, a co-location of industrial space, that you can't have ground floor residential with a parking space next to it. So it's whether we look at off-site contributions and the council can look at upgrading property elsewhere. That's sort of one strategy. But we've also seen, I saw a pre-application request once for a wheelchair block, which didn't really make much sense to me because it was located over industrial space, but with no parking. So I think it's a developer trying to do something, but not communicating it clearly. It's an area I think it's quite challenging at the moment. I think developers need help with it as well.
And do you mean inside as well, when you've got to do the kind of adaptable, accessible targets within the...
That's not so much of an issue internally.
OK.
But I think it's more about the experience of that person living there. And we'll always say, well, if you live on the 18th floor in a wheelchair unit, where's the lift? How to get down to it? What is your journey as a resident to find your parking space or your entrances, all that kind of stuff? But we've also got a live issue of, elevated floor levels because of floodplain issues. So it's very, very, very difficult. And sometimes we've had to accept off-site in the past.
Thank you. Did Suzette want...
Hi, sorry. No, we have got an example of the Barrett scheme. The accessible units there are really great, really. We've been in them. They meet all of the standards, and the adaptable sort of hobs and sinks and everything is sort of up and down. It's really, really clever. It's brilliant, and also I think it would be quite good to use. I know that they have some troubles in occupying all of them, though. So I think that's probably a challenge as well, is the sort of number that we're looking for, and then getting in the private sale particularly. I think the family, the affordable is easier. I'll probably let Colin come in on a bit more. So
you'd say it's easier for people who use wheelchairs to access the social homes rather than a private sale? Is that what you were saying?
So the feedback we get is it's more of an issue of marketing the units. So providing the adaptable units in the affordable where there are allocations from a housing waiting list. So in that instance, those units can be allocated to people who need them. But for the private sale, they're marketed as adaptable units. But the feedback we often get from developers is they don't necessarily get people taking up that provision.
OK, thank you. I'm just going to move on to another question. Just about how the homes interact with the viability assessments, and if that is an issue with delivering the homes that you need in these tall buildings because of the kind of value that the land's given and that kind of interaction.
It's more expensive to provide those units, certainly. They're bigger internally, so it comes at a cost in the viability, but generally most developers have assessed that as part of their purchase of the site. So we don't have an issue with developers turning up saying we're not going to provide that. Most of them have read the policies, they've read the GLA policy, and they provide schemes which meet those requirements.
Shall I move on to my next bit? Similarly to the discussion we've just been having about who lives in the buildings. So general question about what work has been done to understand who is living in tall buildings in your borough. It was something that was picked up in the last panels. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, if I could come in on that. So, yeah, this obviously being a borough that has a lot of tall buildings and is expected to deliver a lot more in the future, something we've been thinking a lot about. And we've done some survey work to look at and the lived experience of people living in tall buildings. So this happened back in 2019, so actually, interestingly, just before the pandemic. So it's an interesting snapshot in time before things changed. This is the first time I'm not sure of any other authority that's done this, and it's the first time certainly we've done it. But we worked with a sort of a market research company. We surveyed initially about 1,000 people who lived in tall buildings in Tower Hamlets. So we picked 10 developments. We worked quotas so that we were kind of interviewing people that weren't all on the same floor, so that we kind of like worked through a sort of strata of the building to try to speak to people at all different kind of levels of the building to understand what their experience was, and collected a lot of data. And with some people, we then drilled down into much more detail and had sort of structured interviews where we kind of really explored some of the issues. It was a very interesting experience. Some very useful information came out of that, which we have shared with the other organisations, and we're happy to share with anybody else. It's quite difficult. It's still, you got that information, it's still quite difficult to kind of then, what does that tell you about what you need to do? And we have managed to draw some inferences from it and say, well, this is the sorts of things we're needing to respond to. The kind of headline thing that we got about people living in tall buildings is generally people are pretty positive about it, which is not really necessarily what we were fully expecting. But when asked what they like about living in tall buildings, and bearing in mind this is people across tenures and people across different floors and also different types of tall building, on the whole, many people reported sort of positively about their lived experience. When you ask them, though, why they picked that tall building and why they lived there, the answers tend to relate more to the location of it and the fact that it was a decent home in a good location, rather than I like living in a tall building because there's a nice view, or there's a community room at the 50th floor and I can see the city or whatever. So it tended to be more, when you try to unpick it, it's more about necessarily, it's a good home in a good location seems to be the real sort of issue. We found about a third of the people living in the people we surveyed were living in homes with families, with children. I'm not sure if you could necessarily extrapolate that across London as a whole, but certainly from speaking to 1,000 people in Tower Hamlets living in tall buildings, a third of them had children. Interestingly, just through a slight nuance of the way that the questionnaire and the surveys worked, when you asked people if they thought it was appropriate for children to live in tall buildings, we asked it in two different ways. I think this is maybe slightly by accident, but first of all, we said living at high density, and I think we actually said something like when lots of people live close together in one building, do you think it's appropriate to live in for children? I can't remember the exact number, but we had a good proportion of people said they did think it was appropriate for children to live like that. But when you then ask the same question, but you change density for tall building, or tower, I think was the word that we used, less people thought it was a good idea. So I think there's a tower seems to be a sort of trigger there, maybe, and there's something about going back to the conversation we were having earlier, thinking about tall building can mean lots of different things to different people. So there's I think it's certainly less appropriate for families and children to live in tall, mega tall towers that have little going on the ground floor, and perhaps more appropriate if for them to live in those lower rise they still constitute tall buildings, but they are. They maybe have more going on ground floor or form a courtyard, and there's more opportunity to have larger units that have access to ground space. Sorry, kind of digressing. Going back to the
that's
previous
really
point
rich
there.
information. I think that shows the importance of understanding people's experiences and who is occupying tall buildings. So we heard that post-occupancy surveys could help to better understand who's living in taller towers, and we didn't know. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what the panel thought of that, and would you be supportive of that as a planning requirement? And I know we're short on time, so if people can
I'll speak to that very quickly because I'll let others come in. But absolutely, yes. So as I say, we did that work ourselves. It was expensive and difficult, but I definitely see the value in it. I believe the onus probably should be put on a developer to do that. I know that some of them do. I've been involved in focus groups where developers want us to help them pick through the results that they've got. But I think there should be an obligation for developers to do that work after a certain period of time, work to a particular standard so that we're all asking the same questions, so we can compare across boroughs, across London, across different types of scheme, and that information should be shared with local authorities, or if not, everybody. Great,
thank you. Any other comments in addition to that, or agreement or disagreement? Yeah, some nodding? Great. Okay, back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Ahmed, please.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies for lateness. Good morning, panel. We are short of time, so I'm going to ask for some very quick punchy answers. And if someone's already said what you think, please don't feel that you need to repeat it. So my first question is, in the absence of minimum targets for open space in the London plan, what mechanisms have you put in place to encourage developers to incorporate meaningful and accessible open spaces within proposals for tall buildings? So if we could start with Michael Ritchie first, please.
So I believe our local plan has a sort of a target for communal amenity space for developments, expressed as a number of square metres per unit. We have also developed guidance for high density development, and in that part of that is looking at ways in which maybe the best way to provide amenity space, or particularly for children, is not necessarily about just saying here's X number of square metres, it's going to be located in a room on the 4th floor or at ground floor. It's about actually how the whole experience of how children move through a building and experience all different parts of it, and try to make as much of the kind of landscape of a development playable. Because anybody who has children will know children don't necessarily always want to play in the designated play area. They want to play on whatever they can climb on. There's a tension there, because obviously you don't want children running amok in corridors and things like that, and some developers, or certainly building managers, we're certainly a bit unsure about whether that is an appropriate thing to do. But there is evidence to suggest that if you make a development, the overall quality of it better, then maybe perhaps you don't need, well, I'm not ever going to say you don't need to have community space, but it can do something to kind of mitigate that.
Thank you.
Assemblyman, can I just briefly interrupt you? So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the A-level politics students from the Harris Clapham Sixth Form in Lambeth who are in the public gallery, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. And we're currently talking about tall buildings and taking evidence from experts from the boroughs. Assembly Member Ahmed, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Bookshelves, I think, is a good place for children, in my experience. Michael Forrester.
So very much the same. And what we've also done is we've got a sort of corporate open space strategy and a play strategy. Because what we find are developers are very good at providing for sort of 0 to 5 on-site play, but doing something that's a bit more interesting than a few rocks to play on. And then the other thing is a real focus on sort of older children, teenagers, and the strategies set out where really we think investment in those spaces should go. So I think we're quite clear corporately where we expect people to pick up.
For young people, do you call them hangout spaces? I've been told that they're called hangout spaces. Is that right? And thank you. And for my constituency, Lambeth and Southwark, for my Southwark colleagues, I'll let you decide who to answer that.
We do have the Greener Belt strategy, and we have contributions to open space where we look at where they can go if it's not all in sort of the area. It's big open space in the parks and different play ranges, so making sure that you've got a range across the areas, different facilities being provided. And again, we do have a play strategy where we're looking at sort of sand and water play quite commonly, and in particular on courtyard spaces as well, so they can be on the podiums and be actually where they live. So yeah, I think most of the thing is making sure that the contributions are going into our strategy where we have set out what we need.
And just to say on tall buildings, we don't require all tall buildings to provide a huge open space, because as part of a plan, you can show where that open space can be provided in that wider area. So we have a kind of an equalisation agreement effectively. So either you're providing development on your site in open space, at which point you give us some money so that we can provide that open space elsewhere, or as part of the plan, you are providing open space on the site. So not all tall buildings necessarily come with a huge open space. If you're doing your plan, which we're all meant to be doing, you should be able to say where that will be. And that's common to anywhere in London. I mean, like estate regens in Southwark and Lambeth. And certainly, we're very conscious of where open space is in Lambeth. We've had asks for money for open space across the borough border. We're quite happy to do that. So yeah, it's about having a plan in place.
Thank you very much. And just moving on to the sustainability of tall buildings, what approaches have you taken to drive down the environmental and climate impacts of tall buildings. Perhaps we could start with Southwark.
I think there's an inherent sustainability about higher density development. So you've got people, as I mentioned earlier, close to where they children go to school, where the GPs are, where they work. You've got more effective use of land. The changes in building regulations are really driving sustainability, and developers are increasingly using more sustainable sources, concrete and steel. Most of the buildings, all of the buildings in Southwark, which are high or high density, are built in concrete and steel for residential. That's a conscious decision of the council after the Lacanol House fire. Other boroughs take different views about structures of buildings and whether they can contain timber. But the view of the council is no, we're going to stick with concrete and steel for fire safety reasons. So those things do come at a carbon cost. There's no denying that. But the industry itself is very efficient at building at high rise and high density. It's had a lot of practice over the last quarter of a century. So I think all those things coming together, particularly changes in building control requirements, mean that these buildings are inherently more sustainable, both in terms of measure of carbon consumption, but also in terms of how they operate socially and within a city, where you're making best use of things like tubes, trains, all the kind of benefits you get of living in a city.
Thank you, Southwark. Moving on to Michael Forrester.
Great, thank you. So, we're looking at a couple of things. So, the most sustainable locations, you're aware that we're promoting the Bakerloo line extension. And something else that we're looking at doing, rather than just sort of building material, but how are those buildings run on energy? So, we've got a sort of energy master plan in the borough. We're lucky that we've got an incinerator in the north of the borough, so Selchip. That does power some Southwark property already, but we're looking at working with them around district heating across the borough. That extends all the way to the Thames and then down to very south of the borough. So we don't have the extra energy and carbon from multiple energy centres all over the place, that we try and manage the heat across the borough, and that in turn will sort of lower your carbon.
Thank you. Michael Ritchie.
I don't really have much to add on that. I think it's a similar experience to other boroughs. I mean, we obviously have policies, and we're strengthening those policies on our new local plan to look at the kind of the sustainability impacts of construction and also operation of buildings. And I'm regularly impressed when I hear people speak about sustainability, particularly of tall buildings, that the kind of the thought and the detail that is clearly going into kind of understanding the impacts of buildings on the long term. It's always whenever I'm asked to speak at a kind of an event where tall buildings are discussed, it seems to be a really strong focus on sustainability. I'm always, as I say, very impressed with the kind of like the thinking and the kind of everyone's very keen to demonstrate their sustainability credentials. And it's obviously clearly a very big consideration now when you design a tall building. I think what we need to see is how that's played out in the design, evolution of the design in the planning application stage. Because sometimes I think for my team, we're talking about schemes and we might be discussing a number of elements of a tall building and how it works, sustainability being one of them. However, we're told, it'll meet your sustainability policy, you don't need to worry about that. Let's talk about the other issues now. And then when it goes to design review, they say, well, of course, it won't meet your policy designed in that way. They'll have to change it at a later date. And you don't know what those changes are going to be and how that's going to play out. And so it seems it's not quite design-led in that sense. And so whilst it might meet the sustainability policy in the long term, is it going to mean some sort of other design compromise somewhere else that we're not yet aware of? Something we have yet to bottom out, I think.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We've got 3 members wanting to intervene at this point. We've got about 5 minutes left. So, first of all, Assembly Member Bailey.
Do you think an addition of a mid-rise policy would be useful to the London plan? If I go to Colin.
Sorry, the addition
of a mid-rise policy or mid-rise buildings. Would you like to see that in the London plan, or is it not necessary?
No. I think the London plan has no shortage of policies as it stands. And I mean, my observation on the London plan would be, I think it would be helpful if it was a bit more strategic in its direction. Getting the DLR here, I passed many mid-rise buildings. I mean, the typology I talked about earlier, tall and then shorter. I mean, that happens anyway. So I don't think there would be much to be gained for trying to prescribe a portion of mid-rise. A lot of mid-rise is built anyway, quite reasonably so, because it works in townscape terms and master plan terms.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you. Just picking up on some points that were just said around sustainability, I just wondered, probably picking up on your comment, Michael, about the discussion with the developers, how compatible tall buildings are with the environmental ambitions of your council.
It's probably difficult for me to answer that because I can't claim to be a sustainability expert per se. I mean, we are, we're reassured when we talk about tall buildings that it is possible to meet that, to meet the standards, and clearly, as I say, a lot of thinking goes into it. One of the issues that local authorities have is I think we lack the expertise to properly interrogate that and understand that. So I think, that's something that we would need support, or we would need further resourcing in order to properly get up to speed with. So that is a challenge that we face.
But some of are nodding. I didn't know if there was any other quick additional comments.
I mean, if you read a sustainability report from a developer, they're pretty hefty documents. They're very, very technical. As Michael said, I mean, by and large, I think we're dependent on those being honest representations of the actual performance of a building. I mean, as Michael said, I mean, a huge amount of effort has gone in and continues to go into making buildings more sustainable, but the technical expertise needed to review those things is considerable, and the resource implications for local authorities are quite considerable as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Can you tell me to what degree, perhaps Mr. Ritchie first and somebody else, you could tell me whether or not how the lifetime costs of tall buildings are estimated, and whether or not they feature in viability assessments?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, actual calculation about the whole. Do you mean like in terms of sustainability, like whole life carbon, or do you mean like
whole life carbon, the cost of replacing lifts in 20 years' time, recladding in 15 years' time, sticking a new roof on in 20 years' time? What assessments do you make when granting planning applications?
I'm not aware of long-term kind of maintenance being taken into account. That's just not to say that it isn't. Again, sorry, I'm not really an expert on viability, so difficult for me to comment.
Anybody else, Mr. Forrester?
I don't think viability assessments go to that level of detail, and that's probably an area that is missing.
It's missing
at the moment. I mean, viability reviews are very, very complicated, as already. We will press around sort of how you maintain the building, particularly around the sort of like facade choice and how that's cleaned. So that's a discussion we're having at sort of pre-app stage and during the application stages. How are you going to maintain this building? And that's becoming more and more prevalent the taller and taller people go. It wasn't an issue 10 years ago, but it certainly is now.
You recognise that there's some leaseholders who wish they'd had a lifetime assessment of the costs of tall buildings. Mr. Wilson.
I just to identify myself as a leaseholder who is currently waiting for major works to take place in the block I live in. I think the point would be that if you live in a bungalow or you live in a 100-metre high tower, it needs maintaining. All property needs maintaining. There is a bit of a history in this country of not maintaining buildings. As Michael said, I think most of the schemes we see are built, and we require them to build of very durable materials. The developer will certainly have in mind life cycle for lifts, roofs, and a kind of replacement, an idea of when those things will be replaced as the building becomes older. I think it would be a massive mistake to load onto the planning system a requirement for the maintenance of buildings to be set out in addition to everything else which is currently required by the planning system. The planning system is part of a solution for delivering housing in this country, but it cannot and it should not be loaded with every problem associated with housing and its maintenance and long-term management. If people are meeting building regulations, buildings should last 40, 50 years. But any building is going to require maintenance, whatever type.
So you're arguing against transparency, really?
No, I'm not arguing against transparency. What I am arguing against is taking a land use development system, the planning system, and loading things on it to which it has never been designed to cope with, or should be coping with.
And of course, the difference between repairing your bungalow and repairing the roof of a block of flats is that you probably own your bungalow. You have no say in the maintenance of a block of flats, or very little.
No, if you own a bungalow, you can choose to let your roof leak, and you can choose to let your windows fall out.
Yeah. Or repair them.
Or repair them. And absolutely, if you're in a block, then there's a whole complexity around leasehold. But that, I think, is something which is an issue which has been looked at the moment, which is leasehold reform. So that, I think, is something sensibly dealt with through leasehold reform.
So leaseholders don't have a choice, of course.
No, and from personal experience, it can be quite frustrating. But, you buy a lease, you buy into that arrangement.
And what you said very early on, this is going to have to be the last question, but you said earlier about play space, because I do find this fascinating about the real costs of tall buildings and how they're hidden from people. But you said earlier about play space, and you said, effectively you can have play space up the road. But it's about accessible play space, isn't it? Isn't that what the London Plan asks for? Accessible play space that is near, that can be supervised by parents. How much do you take that into account rather than just off-siting play space in order to hit a target?
Yeah, a massive credit to the members of our planning committee. I mean, it's something that they have put great emphasis on all the time I've been at Southwark, and we as officers have responded to that. I think Michael mentioned earlier, some play space you can see is quite pathetic, really. It's a couple of rocks, and that's, your kind of engagement as a child. So we've really pushed developers and housing associations and our own housing department to provide, meaningful and imaginative play space. And there has been a whole pushback against that, I have to say. I mean, you would think asking for having a sand pit on a building would not be a huge ask, but people will tell you that, oh no, it's impossible to do something like that. But I mean, one of the things you can use the planning system for is to insist on that quality, and certainly we have, and I know because we've been to have a look at schemes in Tower Hamlets, have been delivering, genuinely accessible and engaging play space. I mean, at the moment we're spending £700,000 on refurbishing a park in the Old Kent Road with Section 106 money from developers who have built developments quite close to this park. And this is a park which has been in a shocking state, not because we own it, but because the housing association owns it. So what we're doing is providing a genuine benefit to new residents and existing residents through the planning system. So you can deliver those things.
Very pleased to hear it. I'm pleased that you won't be repeating what's happened in the borough where I live, where the accessible play space is on top of a neighbouring tower block. So, the kids have got to go down in the lift, cross the lobby, up there, and then play on the roof. I've been very grateful, as you can tell from the interest and the fact that we've run over time. This was a great session, and we really do appreciate you coming to give evidence today. We're now going to have a short adjournment while we change panels. But thank you so much. It's been very educational. Thank you. Welcome back to the London Assembly's Planning and Regeneration Committee. We now continue our discussion on planning and tall buildings, and I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests. We have here Jules Pipes, EBE, the Deputy Mayor of London for Planning, Regeneration and Fire Service, and Alan Smith is the Principal Strategic Planner at the Greater London Authority. I'm going to start with the first question, and that is, Deputy Mayor, how does the GLA assure itself that the London Plan Policy D9 is working as intended?
I'm not sure how I can say how we do it, but it's more of a case of but we do have a view about how well it's working. I mean, broadly, we think that. I mean, I'm sure the committee have understood this from their recent meetings and having read the policy, that there's broadly three parts to D9: A, B, and C. A requires boroughs to decide on what is their definition of tall buildings. Part B requires them to draw up a map of where is best located, where are the best locations for those tall buildings that meet that definition, and then Part C judges those buildings, their impact on an area and their qualities. And I'd say that broadly, Part C we feel does work well. It does provide robust assessment criteria against which to assess tall buildings. Whilst parts A and B are perhaps sound simpler than Part C, I think they've been more problematic in their application. I mean, certainly on Part A, the definition of tall buildings, whilst it can be seen as a positive thing to let boroughs decide, you know, every area is different. London is a collection of villages. Having a different definition, stepping 1 foot over the boundary to another borough, can cause confusion, and also in certainly the design of a city, is it the right thing to do? So they have, and they go wildly from, I think one borough is 75 metres, and I'm guessing, I think that's probably Southwark, isn't it? City. Yeah. But anyway, 75 metres at one end of the spectrum, and much lower, several stories, you know, about 4 or 5 stories in another borough. And then on Part B, there's been a fair bit of ambiguity about how that applies when determining applications. Certainly, it gets taken as a gateway, which obviously it can't do. At the end of the day, whether a building is or is not in a defined area, it is subject to Part C regardless. So I suppose there is a question mark over the usefulness of Part B, and this is something that we'll be exploring in the review of the London Plan, and it will certainly feature as far as it will certainly feature in the consultation that will be beginning in April. So I suppose that probably does answer your question. How do I judge the effectiveness? We'll be asking everybody this April, I suppose.
Yes. And presumably you've had conversations with the boroughs as to whether or not D9 is working for them?
Yes. I mean, we obviously get feedback from boroughs, and that kind of has led to the kind of view I've just expressed, that for some it's useful, some less so. I suppose it depends on the particular development and whether you end up where you wanted to be, I guess, whether you've permissioned it or whether you've refused it.
The Mayor's, in July last year, the Mayor said that my London Plan aims to ensure that tall buildings come forward in the right locations and are of high architectural quality. Can you point us towards any specific examples of tall buildings you would assess as falling into that?
Well, they all fall into the broad category that they have been assessed for their qualities, but obviously they they have been assessed by different people with different. It's it's the decision maker who is deciding whether it meets those criteria or not. So one person's exemplary architecture is another person's eyesore. But in planning terms, we think that the criteria are suitable for a planning decision to be made, and those that pass as the decision maker, in the judgment of the decision maker, they have met those criteria. I'm reluctant to pick out buildings that I think are exemplary, because the next question is which ones that aren't, and I don't think I want to go there.
Right. Well, some of the feedback we've got from the boroughs is that there's a kind of material difference between a design at, say, 20 stories and again at 40 stories. As far as they're concerned, there are different architectural challenges. Do you think that the next London plan would make a distinction between those tall and very tall buildings?
Would this be in relation specifically to residential or generally?
I think the review we're doing is about residential.
Yeah. Well, I would be very interested in the feedback from the consultation, and whether that was an appropriate distinction, and not just above 20, but at whatever the particular level is. I mean,
we've had architects saying it's a whole different
whole new level of expense.
It's a whole different thing when you're doing 20 or 40 for a whole lot of engineering reasons.
Yeah, and it gets much more expensive as well. Yeah. So yeah, we'd be interested in the feedback, but not just the difference between 20 and above, but any comments on any particular typologies that people feel lend themselves better to residential. I mean, obviously we've talked many times in committee and elsewhere about the difference between mid-rise and above, and the suitability for families, for example.
Indeed, I think we'll probably come on to that later on, but now we'll be going to Assembly Member Baker for the next question.
Thanks, Chair. So we were talking earlier on to the boroughs about the locations of taller buildings and sort of clustering, and the reality is, and obviously this is part of what the London plan leans towards, is that you get clusters of tall buildings in opportunity areas or round transport in town centres. So is this, are there any drawbacks? Obviously, this is what the London plan was leaning towards, So are there any drawbacks that you've seen in the way this has played out over the past few years? Because certainly we were talking earlier on to boroughs a bit about what Londoners in general sort of expected. I'm not sure they quite expected this sort of spiky version that we were getting, even though that's what the plan says. Are there any things that you would consider, you would have hoped would have played out a little bit differently in the implementation of the last few years?
I mean, there are the obvious clusters of Corporation and Canary Wharf, but then you've also got these other additional clusters, such as the one at Blackfriars, for example, on the south side.
I think I'm talking about sort of smaller clusters, not those big city
town
ones.
Centres.
So town centres, I may be thinking, this is a little bit, I'm talking across other Assembly members, I'm sure would raise it, but for instance, there's quite a cluster in Ilford. I think Croydon comes up a lot. There's a lot of clusters of tall buildings, residential, around town centres, which I think sort of, from my experience, Londoners are a bit like, oh, didn't expect that. But that is actually what the London plan is leaning towards.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I suppose the height is an issue, but I'm more interested in the density, how close together they are, what it means for ground level, what other amenities are, which are all the knock-on effects. So is this exactly how you expected it to play out? Bearing in mind you don't have total control, because obviously it's local plans, or are there things that you'd like to see?
Regardless of whatever the policies are, there are always going to be things that don't fit perfectly.
Yes.
Decisions are taken in the round against all the different planning policies, so it doesn't meet every policy perfectly. So there will always be things one doesn't like. So with prompting, I can probably agree with you, say, yeah, that's not a good example. But generally, yes, you're absolutely right. The policy does the plan does drive greater density to points points that are well served by transport. Inevitably, those are places that have developed as shopping places, town centres, and where there are good transport nodes. The plan does seek to densify around those to avoid car-based development, and also that there's the amenities, the shops, entertainment, whatever, around nearby to those, and compact towns and cities are better than urban sprawl. Is the theme, I guess, of the approach.
Yeah, and I think that was, I can't remember the quote yet, but I think that was a quote from somebody on our previous panel last time, which was, this is the most sustainable way to build cities. But of course, that's not the way everyone exists in a city or necessarily expects to exist in a city. But in terms of, say, I don't know, around Canning Town, where we have lots of tall buildings, you don't necessarily have the town centre amenities or local ground level that might have sort of been expected as they were built. Are there other things that can be done to ensure when these sort of developments are built, they are effectively more livable at ground levels with amenities and green space and things like that? Because we certainly heard on the first panel that when we used to build tall buildings in council estates, you'd have your big tall building, they had some lower rise and you'd have space and things like that. Again, they didn't always work, but that element of it was done differently.
Well, I mean, that's definitely all in the plan. I mean, we very much press against having dead frontages and, I mean, there are plenty of tower blocks built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s where all you have is one door in, and then all the way around it's just kind of like bin chambers, blank wall, storage.
Yes, I wasn't using an example on everything.
And the plan absolutely discourages that and very much promotes active frontages. I mean, the ideal would be, shops and facilities on the ground floor, maybe even an office on the floor above or something, and then floors 3, 4, 5 and upwards being, whether it's mid-rise to 6 stories or it's 20 stories, to have that kind of... But probably if it's 20 stories, it's more of a point block, so you probably have a limited footprint. So realistically, it's probably not going to have a variety. But it's one of those kind of more longer blocks. And at mid-rise, you're probably more likely to have a variety of things going on underneath.
Is there more the London plan could do to ensure that some of the places where it's not working, which of course then are making the idea of building tall buildings less attractive in other places as well, because people are going, well, I don't quite I've been there and I don't quite like the way it's playing out. Is there more the London plan could do to make sure the other aspects of not just the height are managed better? Or are you saying this is more local?
I'm more absolutely open to being to suggestions coming in the consultation that we're about to undertake. But I think in the current plan, it's all in there. Whether it's always realised is a different question. I mean, everything that you have said that is desirable, I'm confident we can point to in the plan where it says that should happen.
Should be there.
But should is not must. Must cannot be written into the plan, and even when it does creep in, it can't actually be enforced. Planning's discretionary decision-making process, and everything's on balance, all the policies in the round. That ends up being a kind of an imperfect process for dictating that things must have X, Y, Z attached to it. I think what you're saying, though, it does strike me that perhaps from some of the earlier things you were saying about height, and people kind of like encounter it, go, oh, I didn't really expect it to be there. I mean, that comes back to our old friend viability, or more our old foe viability.
Yeah.
The fact that drives height.
Yes.
If things were more viable than they were, if the land had been cheaper, and if we weren't so reliant on Section 106 to provide affordable housing,
Yeah.
generally buildings would be a lot lower in London.
Yeah.
Also, there's obviously the historical aspect as well, that it didn't develop like Paris, so we've got a lot of two-storey, and that puts puts a lot of pressure on the remaining land that then goes high. Whereas if it had been
Yes.
built out like Paris a couple of hundred years ago, we'd have an awful lot more of seven-storey mid-rise and probably a lot fewer tower blocks.
Yes. Yeah. No. Understood. Let's see whether you want to answer this. Is there an upper limit to the number of tall buildings that you would be happy to see in London? Are we getting towards that, or do you think there's a lot more scope for that type of development in London?
That's a hard question.
I know.
Hard question.
I didn't want to go. It didn't provoke a coughing fit in it. Alan, have you got a thought? Well,
Yeah, go on,
Jules
you fill in
recovers.
while I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, I suppose, is that tall buildings should respond to the context, and we recently published guidance, characterisation and growth strategy (LPG), which talks boroughs through the process of undertaking a characterisation process and then identifying those areas. So instead of putting a number to it, I think it feels like there's that process of going through that characterisation process and then identifying the locations and that being the driver for where tall buildings are.
Yeah.
And then you'd have to mix in the drivers that I mentioned, including the ones about housing need as well.
Yeah. Do you think there's any value? I mean, I don't know. London's a big place. You experience it in the places you live and work and go. But do you think there would be any advantage for those parts of London where they are feeling like there's just going to be high rises everywhere, that there might be some reassurance to say, look, it's going to be here and not at the end of your terraced road? Is there any value in that across London?
Well, I suppose that's what D9 attempted to do, but...
Except Londoners don't normally read D9, I suppose.
No, yeah,
do you know what I mean?
But I mean, the reality of it is
Yeah.
the fact that D9 does... It's hard to dictate, because
Yeah.
even if you're drawing those lines on a map,
Yeah.
you can't... someone can still put an application in for
Yes.
that, and it still has to be judged on its own merits, and it could be found on there. You can't... and there was a bit of case law on it, that you can't...
Just put that upper limit on.
Yeah, you just can't say, I'm sorry, it's in an area that's marked not for tall buildings, and therefore, because yours meets the local definition of a tall dibuilding, you cannot build it. You just can't. You can't enforce that. I mean, I suppose it is a kind of a. I suppose some people may think that, there's a desire to create tall buildings. And actually, as far as I'm concerned, that's completely absent. I don't think there is a driver. Despite what it may appear like to the public, I don't think anyone's got, tall buildings are brilliant, let's have more of them. It's the result of the things that we just discussed, the drivers of viability, of housing need. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much. Back to you, Chair.
Just very briefly, I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Garbett in a moment. Earlier you commented about Part B of D9 being kind of ineffective, and I think you alluded to it there as well. So how can we make that effective? How can boroughs be put back in the driving seat when there's clearly maybe a local need for that to take place in the planning system?
I don't know, because as I say, it's been shown through case law that it can't be stopped. I mean, it was the Master Brewer case where they weren't even tall. I mean, what, six, 7 stories?
11.
Oh, 11 stories. 11 stories, but it was right next to, was it Hillingdon Tube?
Yes, my old stomping
So you know it well.
Master. I've got drunk there many times.
An area perfectly acceptable for a building of 11 stories, or the tallest one being 11 stories. And it wasn't in an area marked for tall buildings. And so the council did proceed to JR the decision on the basis that it shouldn't have been given permission, even though it had met the design criteria in D9C. And the judgment was, and the case law is now quite clear, that D9B cannot be taken as a gateway policy. And the thing is that you can't have any gateway policies in the plan. So unless it's yeah, I mean, you would be able to, I suppose, and I defer to Alan on this, but if something, say, was next to a conservation area or next to a World Heritage Site or something, then obviously other policies would begin to bite, but even they would be taken as part of a judgment decision, not an absolute. I mean, I think there was probably, I mean, there would be a, I mean, even the, I suppose the things that come closest, perhaps, is the viewing corridors. I mean, if something came up in the central red area of a viewing corridor, on the, so it pops up on the shoulder of St Paul's, then I'm looking at Alan to help me out. Then how that decision making is it still a decision for something for the decision maker, or how absolute would that be to rule it out?
No, it will still be a decision for the decision maker, and they will be assessing the plan as a whole. I think in that instance, the wording is very clear in terms of what it should do. I think where Part B potentially has sort of lacked a bit is that it didn't really identify what should happen if tall buildings were proposed outside the areas, and I think that's made it difficult for decision makers to know how to proceed.
Assembly Member, we just slightly adjusted the order of the questions to aid the flow. Assembly Member Garbutt, please.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button then. Thank you. Just to follow up on some of the questioning from Assembly Member Baker on density, and what you've just said, Deputy Mayor, about viability driving height. So the density matrix was abandoned in the London Plan for 2021, which can be seen as increasing speculation of the land, therefore the land price going up, therefore the opportunities for affordable homes going down. So I just wondered if there was any reflection on the lack of the density matrix, and if there's any thought of bringing that back.
No, well, I think the density matrix, if it ever did work, it was very much a thing of its time. Certainly by the time we looked at bringing forward the current plan, it was clear that most development fell outside of the density matrix. Something like 2/3 or 3/4 of permissions fell outside of the recommended range for the location. The majority of those were higher, some were lower. So if you have a policy, if you have a policy of which isn't observed about 2/3, 3/4 of the time, it brings it kind of into question. And
so who wasn't observing it? Who wasn't observing it?
Well, the system, because like D9, every application would have to be judged on its merits, and if the decision maker felt that the application could go forward and approved it, the decision maker, the person writing the report, and then subsequently the decision maker will be deciding that the application was acceptable, regardless of what the density matrix said. Because the density matrix can't be a limit any more than D9B. You can say, oh, well, it fell outside it, so you can't build it. It's, you know, the density matrix was a guide. And actually, even if you attempted to strengthen it as a policy and saying, because, you know, it was split up into kind of like inner urban and outer urban and things like that, wasn't it? And if it was in that particular location saying, right, well, that means it has to fall into that number of units per hectare and that unit number of hectares. But someone says, well, no, it's like actually well served by public transport and there's loads of open space nearby, et cetera, it could be denser. And that's going to get through, and did. So that's why, again and again, things did not fall in the density. And I think it proved to be too, I don't know, I suppose that's too crude, I guess, at all, about not. So, and the current plan was definitely much on, the emphasis was on being design-led and every site being judged on its own merits and being assessed for its capacity, rather than just simply giving it a capacity based on its type of location.
I guess it's the thanks for explaining that dynamic, and I think it's the bit that I'm really interested in, though, is the speculation that then comes from that land, which then increases the price of the land, because we heard this in the previous panel, which means that as you just said, OFO viability comes into play. So I just wondered if there's any attempt to control the land price inflation in the next London plan and this element of speculation.
Yeah, I mean, before I forget, I mean, obviously the London Plan still does take a vestige of the matrix approach, in that some of the numbers are used as triggers for higher scrutiny because of the height of the building. That's still in the current plan. And on the issue of speculation, I think speculation happened before this plan, long before this plan, and I don't think that change made it any worse. And obviously the things that would slow land inflation would be the policy requirements within the plan, and the key one of those, of course, is the requirement for the strategic requirement 50%, the threshold approach for 35%. And that being embedded in land values. And we think that we have seen some of that over recent years.
Okay, thank you. I think it's one to keep thinking about and pushing on, but thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hirani, please.
Thank you, Chair. And my question's to the Deputy Mayor first. So what role does the Mayor and yourself envisage for taller buildings in helping to tackle London's housing crisis?
They, as I said previously, they have their role, and that is one of the drivers for them being brought forward. Subject to obviously all the policy requirements in being in the right place, or judged to be right place in the view of the decision maker. For all the reasons I've previously said about land availability, the fact that so much of London is built out at 2 stories, 3 stories, isn't going to be redeveloped anytime soon. Land availability is one of the factors that drives height. We now have a target of 88,000 homes a year, but even when it was almost irrelevant, really, because even when it was 56,000 or 40,000, those were high figures to me. So that does drive height.
Okay. And do you feel there's a need for any strategic oversight on proliferation of tall buildings?
One thing I suppose I would say is that, I mean, we're currently considering a lot of different options, and in the coming months we're planning to publish a high-level document and consult on that, which will have a number of options that we're thinking about, not the only ones, and it will just focus on the things to potentially change. But as I say, So I think, the key aspect to mention, to clarify, is just that we're considering, a number of different options.
I mean, at the moment, there are elements of that strategic overview. For example, this is more commercial in the city, but the viewing corridors, the requirement to avoid sort of canyonization, particularly canyonization of the river. So there is an element of a kind of a strategic take on the location of these things. And actually D9 itself is obviously an attempt at a strategic oversight of where tall buildings are located. But as Alan says, it is something that is absolutely wide open for consultation, to this invitation to everyone to input into the next plan. That, perhaps I'm taking your words too far, but if you wanted to kind of like centrally control where tall buildings have that kind of degree of strategic oversight of the location of tall buildings, it is absolutely open for someone to suggest that in this consultation.
Okay. And just to revisit an issue that you raised a few moments ago, just about areas that are not designated for tall buildings and it being possible to build tall buildings. Is that something that you would look to address in terms of, if a scenario like that was to happen, these are the things that need to be in place to support that happening in areas that haven't been identified or looked at?
Well, that's currently what's in the plan, that if it can fall outside of a designated area, and then it will be subject to the tests of D9C. But actually, even if it was in an area, it's still subject to the tests of D9C. So actually, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying, Alan, that even if someone proposed something in D9 that was in a designated area, it isn't effectively a permitted development or a presumption of approval. And actually, it does kind of, I think I'm right in saying that really it even fails to be a presumption of approval. Sorry, presumption that it won't be refused on height alone. So say it met say it met most policy requirements, and it was in an area designated for tall buildings. It would be it would probably be somewhat perverse for someone then to try and refuse it on height, but it might be possible. Probably more on massing than on height, I guess. If it, but it's not a. But as I say, to be for an area to be so designated as suitable for tall buildings, it doesn't mean to say that it's just like carte blanche to do anything.
Yeah, just sort of interested to get your view on this, because where I've seen it work well in terms of tall buildings proliferated in a certain area, it tends to be a single or just a few developers. There's land ownership and the complexities of developers or buildings and people and the facilities in the local area have an impact in terms of placemaking and the buildings as such, not physically but speaking to each other. If you understand what I'm trying to get at.
Placemaking and curation of place always makes for better places, and there always should be a guiding hand, whether it's a master plan that the council has led on, whether it's a big regeneration site, and then it's kind of the developer or developer jointly with the council. But that kind of guiding, curating hand on to deliver good placemaking always invariably ends up with better places than simply ad hoc development. But in the real world, obviously, land ownership, and when someone brings forward a single 30 by 30 metre site, it struggles to deliver on all the different policies within the curtilage of that site, and that's when you start compromising on contributions to other things. I don't know, take play space, for example. If you've got a single point building other than the roof, where is the play space going? You know, and with the best will in the world, no one's going to get away with refusing a building, saying, well, no, that site can just have a low-rise building on half of it and the other half is play space. I mean, that's never going to that's never going to be a refusable situation. So instead, they would be expected to make a contribution to nearby play space. And say it's one that's kind of a typical kind of compromise you would end up with on a limited site. And then the borough then ends up trying to correlate all these different ad hoc developments to make a place as a whole.
Thank you. Assembly Member Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, good afternoon, panel, this afternoon now. Firstly, just following on from your exchange with Assembly Member Hirani, you talked about what's driving proliferation of taller buildings, and it might not necessarily be what we would have wanted, but because of not being able to have a kind of slightly higher density elsewhere. Although noting that the figures that we've had in our briefing now, I guess depending on what the sort of criteria might be, that the figures might have shown something slightly different. But using 20 stories as the benchmark, then we've seen from 2019 onwards a steady decrease in completions year on year on year, and now the latest figures in the briefing document for 2023 show actually a lower level than at any time since since this mayoral administration. So I'm just wondering kind of what's driving that, and whether that feeds into wider concerns about impact on deliverability of housing more generally. And I know in particular you mentioned in November you had a degree of concern about whether or not the government would be able to meet its overall 1.5 million target during the Parliament. Do you have any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah. I mean, the downturn is in all housing types, and so that figure would just be commensurate with the downturn with housing overall, except perhaps where there is an extra problem with taller buildings that have obviously been in play, that we've encountered over the last 18 months or so, which of course is the issue about second staircases, and the confusion which sadly still continues at the moment, with a recent turn in British standards that seems to be now raising the issue again of having more than a single staircase, and requiring additional lifts, and you get into additional lifts, and then you get into additional refuge space and additional pressurized lobby space, and then if it's actually you've still only got 8 flats in a core, which in design terms never required more than a single core, but in safety terms now is requiring a second core, it does start putting a real question mark over the viability, and in the short term it is stalling things, and there are some major sites across London that are currently stalled, that it's both viability, but also there are question marks about lifts even once the viability issues are addressed.
And then my second question is relating to mid-rise, which we talked about a little bit. And I understand from some of the kind of stakeholder consultation events, there's been a degree of support expressed for that. So the question really is then whether you think that should feed into a specific policy. We heard one of the guests on the earlier panel thought that actually a specific policy probably wasn't necessary. Thought the London Plan already has enough policies, and they don't really want to add more to it. But I'd be keen to understand whether you think that a new kind of mid-rise policy would be helpful in kind of proliferating that kind of development.
I'm going to hand over to Alan on this. I mean, the plan doesn't drive taller buildings. It is a horses for courses thing, and these things are meant to be location specific. Other than, I suppose, that there is obviously the driver. It's one of the overriding objectives of the plan, one of the 6 objectives, to make the best use of land. So if somewhere was really appropriate for a taller building, if we're talking, the Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf, it would be odd to only do a mid-rise, a low-rise or mid-rise buildings in those places, because it wouldn't be seen to be not making the best use of land. But that isn't the same as saying every bit of land has to be sweated and gone to the maximum height. Alan?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to mention as well is in recent London Plan guidance, we already advocate for mid-rise development. I think there are examples of where we've shown good examples of where actually a tall building was proposed and actually subsequently it was changed and a mid-rise development was proposed after that, and we sort of have specifically referenced that to sort of point applicants and boroughs in the way of mid-rise, because there are those benefits. All being so, it may not be possible in all locations, or it may not be viable in all locations. We have guidance as well that also advocates for the looking of different typologies. So before reaching one typology, let's say a tall building, scrutinising that it couldn't be delivered in a different type of typology, such as a mid-rise typology. Going back to your point specifically around, whether that could be a new policy, again, this is something, no decisions have been made. We're considering a range of options. We're interested to hear different stakeholders' view on that. That being said, given what Jules has said about the current tall building policy and how we're likely to want to change some of that anyway, I suppose there's questions around, whether parts of that can also feature a kind of mid-rise development. But yeah.
Thank you. And back to Assembly Member Garbett, I think.
Yep, it's me again. So we've had quite a lot of discussion in our previous investigation, part 1, around who lives in the taller buildings. So I just wondered what work the GLA's done to help boroughs understand who lives in these tall buildings and how that might inform the next plan.
I think, yeah, do you want? I think I'm going to cough.
Yeah, so I mean, we're aware of things like the housing, the English Housing Survey, which I think has done quite extensive work in terms of different occupancy levels in different types of buildings. I think because there's existing surveys out there and evidence and research out there, we're not intending at this moment to commission further evidence-based work on that, just given that there is that evidence out there.
And what we heard from the panel this morning with the boroughs is some extensive work that Tower Hamlets had done into understanding, I think, 1,000 residents. Yeah. And there was support for developers to take on that post-occupancy survey requirement and building that into planning, so they were kind of done in the same time scale to the same standard. So I don't know if that's something that could be considered.
Yeah, I mean, that's how Housing and Land are doing that.
Yeah, so Housing and Land do have a post-occupancy evaluation structure in place. So yeah, that currently does happen.
So what do we learn? What do we learn from that then?
Residents' experience of new development. One thing I do know is that I don't think it currently factors in specific aspects around the buildings itself. And what I mean by that is you might not be able to disaggregate the data from who lived in a tall building over here to who lived in a mid-rise building over here, and therefore draw conclusions on that. I don't know if it goes into that granularity of detail. But as I say, that's, I know our colleagues in Housing and Land oversee that.
Okay, I think that's something it'd be good for the committee to, understand a bit more of and how it links to that request from the boroughs. But thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you think there's any buildings are there any types or tenures or demographics who tall buildings don't suit or are not suitable for?
Well, in guidance, we do recommend that in social housing, families are within the 5th floor or below, in the ground of first 5 floors, isn't it? That's in the guidance. But I'd contrast that with the fact that, we do have some very tall residential buildings. Those ones that are very tall are generally private occupation, and some families will elect to occupy those, buy those, rent those, when they clearly have other options. So I don't think it's a generality that we can say that all families would be against living in taller buildings. But where obviously there are fewer options available to people, such as in affordable housing, as I say, the policy guidance does advise against, but it wouldn't be. But again, it wouldn't be enforceable. I mean, if you had a affordable housing block, would one dictate that there were only 1-bedroom flats above the 5th floor? I don't think that actually would even be an enforceable policy. And not only in planning terms, but I don't think any registered social landlord taking it on would be willing to take on a block that only had that. So whilst the sentiment is there and it's expressed in policy guidance, it would be very difficult to mandate, both in planning terms or in housing allocation policy, that no family has ever got put into homes above the 5th floor.
Yeah, well, due to housing pressure in London, presumably. I was going to talk about 303 Queensbridge Road, but you're well familiar with 303 Queensbridge Road, which was a tower block with very content 60 pluses, and then they started moving families back in. How does the GLA assure itself that developers will prioritise quality public spaces?
How
does it, because there's no targets for open space in the London plan, how do you assure that developers will prioritise quality public spaces and accessible ones as well?
Well, there are requirements for... Oh, you're poised with your finger on the button.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I know that in the London Plan policy S4, so that's around play and informal recreational space. So that does set a requirement, I think, for 10 square metres per child. So that's worked out on and anticipating the number of children for that development.
But in terms of accessible children's play space in new developments, including tall buildings, or more perhaps specifically tall buildings, how do you ensure that?
So, well, I suppose through a range of policy and guidance. One specific guidance that I'm aware of is the Making London Child-Friendly guidance, which is all about public play space and public realm and how to make that of higher quality. So I know there's a number of different techniques that guidance advocates.
But as I've said, when you have a single point development, the challenge is much greater than if you're redeveloping an estate. And then
I get that point, but it always seems to be that more often than not seems that the requirement for accessible play space loses out in that balance of considerations when planning permissions are given. It's the one that can be easily dispensed with.
Well, I think it's more a case of not so much easily dispensed with. It probably ends up being transposed into something like a payment in the Section 106 towards improving and upgrading existing play space. Because in reality, there isn't the space in the urban setting to create new open space.
Yeah. But it's it's a problem, isn't it? Creating this. I know it's something that really exercised the attention of Nicky Gavron, which was the chairman of this committee, and wanting to ensure that had some strong emphasis. How do you think you could put more emphasis on the creation of play space? Because otherwise, what we're effectively doing is, it appears to me, we're creating developments, and for those kids being brought up in those developments, it's difficult to get to play space, and we know what the effect of a lack of accessible play space has on the development of young minds. So, what do you think could be?
Well, as I said, I mean, in the policy, it does make that requirement. But when the decision maker is faced with, and those drafting the report and assessing the site, if I'm looking around this room, I mean, it's probably a bit smaller than that, but it's not inconceivable that you will have a development on a footprint of this room. It's like the play space is either going on the roof, which is increasingly common, or it's a payment to an off-site to an off-site existing space. That there isn't another option other than say the building doesn't happen. Or a much smaller building on only slightly the site, but even then, a play space part of this site, it's just not, in the real world, it's just not practical on every single site. So it ends up coming down to a payment to observe the spirit of investment in children's play space, rather than being able to manifest an extra piece of land with green space, grass and swings on it. But as I say, if the development proposal is purely for a site as big as this chamber in a tight urban setting, that's the realistic outcome. But the policy is there that it's either it's actually a requirement to provide space, but then it isn't provide the space or give us some money. It's provide the space. But then the decision maker is faced with, do I refuse this on the basis that it cannot physically provide the outdoor space? And I don't think that would survive appeal if you, I don't know, just down the road, I don't know, Old Kent Road near Zone 1, and this was the plot of land, and Southwark was saying, well, no, we were going to refuse it because there's no outdoor play space in it. I mean, it wouldn't be...
We could probably have a whole investigation on accessible play space, to be honest.
But Chair, I really do think that it's the issues of when they are. I mean, there may be collectively too many of these instances, but they are instances of constrained sites. If someone, I would be appalled if people could point to sizable developments that were failing to address this and to address outdoor space properly and provision, but I'm realistic about constrained sites. And then I think the question mark is then how are local authorities marshalling the payments to improve local provision?
Let's go on to the next question. I've got so many questions I could ask. And I'm really going to have to hold back. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Deputy Mayor, we heard some support for providing information to buyers of units within tall buildings around the lifetime costs in the same way as they would receive an energy performance certificate. Is that something that you would support?
Absolutely. I'm not sure whether it's such a planning issue, but I'm absolutely in favour of the principle. I mean, I think there's a big question mark about the maintenance costs of buildings that were built probably in the 90s and thousands. I think developers are getting more aware in the building methods that they're using now, and the ability to reglaze buildings without having to completely cover them in scaffolding again, and being able to replace glazing from the inside, things like that for refurbishment. And they're thinking ahead the sort of 30, 40, 50 years of refurbishing the buildings in more recent cases. I think that's probably an issue for older buildings.
Yeah, I think you've covered it. Yeah, I'm, like you say, not sure where it sits, but be interested to explore some of this further, definitely.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I'm interested in that response because, as I said to the previous panel, there's lots of leaseholders out there who really wish they'd got the lifetime costs or some estimate of the lifetime costs of maintaining the building, over which they have very little control. And I mean, viability is a planning issue. I don't see why sustainability can't be one as well, and not just in terms of climate, but in terms of economics as well. And I'd really look to see if that was something that could be at least addressed in the new London plan.
I mean, it's beyond my knowledge about how deep the whole life carbon costs and things go, and how they factor in renewal. Actually, I think you'd have to have someone from the energy team in front of you to go to the ins and outs of that. But obviously, there have been attempts to estimate, and it's a requirement to submit the whole life carbon costs of buildings as part of their planning applications. And although we haven't yet set sort of benchmarks or limits, because although it was thought about in the last plan, there wasn't the evidence base to do that. So actually, that's why the new element in the plan was to start building that element, that evidence base, by requiring the figures for whole life carbon. So again, it'll be views welcome in this consultation. It'll be interesting to see whether it's felt that there's sufficient evidence now to actually go forward with any kind of either benchmark or even, kilograms of carbon per square metre allowable for different typologies. But again, that would be completely at the discretion of the inspectors whether they would feel that that was a viable approach. But obviously, it's definitely something we'd be. I think it's inconceivable that we wouldn't be exploring that issue in the forthcoming plan.
That's very good news to hear, actually. Assembly Member Baker.
I just wanted to remind everyone that we did an investigation on this last year, I believe. So I don't think I think somebody else was there from the GLA, but just wanted to remind everyone of that.
From the energy team.
Yeah. I mean, you can be pretty sure that we'll submit quite a bit of evidence. As an aside, when can we expect the high-level document?
April.
April. We'll now move on to, I think it's our final question, Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you. So picking up on the themes around whole life carbon and sustainability, which Andrew looked at me for, which I quite enjoyed. So given the disproportionate carbon cost of construction around tall buildings, I wondered if you feel that they're justifiable within the context of the Mayor's 2030 net zero target.
Well, it's a balance to be taken. With so many people to house, it's inevitable that a compromise is sought. You simply can't build something of that the heights that we do, say solely from carbon. It does involve concrete and steel. And there is a carbon cost to that. But obviously there are plenty of policies that try to minimise the carbon input and also the carbon that is expended to try and, looking at the kind of circular, the carbon economy and the kind of, reuse, recycle, even when things are dismantled, things are meant to be, go through the hierarchy of reuse or recycling before disposal.
Has there been any modelling done around the impact of tall building development on London's carbon emissions?
There definitely, obviously there is data. I couldn't swear that anyone's done quite what your direction you're heading in there about sort of carbon cost per person or something. I mean, inevitably, if someone was living in a low-rise timber building, the carbon footprint of that person is going to be less than the person who's in the concrete and steel building, undeniably. But one typology, the former typology, doesn't supply the amount of housing that we need to build.
Yeah,
and actually, even if one had enough land, then you would just be building on more land and probably more green space. Actually, if you were building at that level, so it would end up being more car-based. Certainly, would involve more transport. So it's all a balance.
Yeah, and I guess that's what the modelling's about, isn't it? Like what are our current buildings that are in planning or are in process? What is that impact on carbon? Because I think it links back to your first answer to the first part of this. And just, I wanted to ask if there's any consideration for stricter carbon limits or alternative design incentives to reduce the overall environmental impact.
Yes. I mean, that's why in the last plan we did, this is just the previous answer I gave, that's why we put the carbon cost into the last plan so that it would drive the evidence, create the evidence base on which to come to a judgment whether one could have limits, a sort of carbon expenditure limit per square metre, for example, on different typologies.
So has that worked then? Do you feel the whole life carbon kind of assessment has worked in terms of driving down the whole life carbon rather than just kind of stating it, I guess?
Well, it's undoubtedly been good practice. So then it has been able to be debated and discussed. But I think we've probably been slightly overtaken in the commercial sector because they have tenants who are demanding best in class in terms of carbon use. And so that has driven commercial landlords to demand high performance buildings in terms of carbon. I think, in my view, residential is perhaps a bit more behind that curve. The developers in residential don't have that kind of demanding audience in quite the same way. Just because I think, I'm not saying that individuals don't want to live in thermally efficient, carbon neutral buildings, but the collective voice of residents isn't the same as, I don't know, some bank that's demanding its headquarters is the most carbon efficient and most forward-thinking.
I guess that speaks to sometimes what Assembly Member Bailey mentions about the voice of the communities who are going to be living in the buildings. And I think strengthening that, anything that makes those homes as as efficient as possible. Obviously, we know that drives down people's bills, and I think everyone would be pro living in a house with lower bills. So yeah, I think it's an interesting area for us to keep.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, no. I think on thermal efficiency, I'm not saying that they're not in the front seat. No, it's more embodied carbon I was talking about. So yeah, so I think everyone's on the same page on thermal efficiency. It's more that on the embodied carbon, I think that the that commercial seems to be ahead of residential, I think.
And are they commonly being delivered to that high standard then in terms of, thermal efficiency? Because I hear, I'm sure other people do, complaints that buildings aren't kind of built to the highest noise insulating standards, and it obviously causes conflict in the local area, even though that's the developer responsibility. So is that followed through in these aspects?
I haven't heard that one about noise, so I couldn't really comment.
I think that's an interesting one for us to pick up in this investigation, because I've heard that people who live, in the blocks, obviously you've got the agent of change principle, that the people moving in can't complain about the existing kind of clubs and bars. But if the building isn't then insulated, which is the developer responsibility, it causes conflicts between the people living in the building and their neighbours.
That I am fully aware of. Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought you meant just general noise.
But I just wondered if that then played out similarly in the environmental space. Like it was an idea, but it's not actually followed through.
Sorry, I saw you waving something.
Well, I suppose one thing I would just add is and this was alluded to in your previous panel, but it was sort of how much of this could or should sit with building regulations as opposed to planning, because I think often some of these things, there might be space there for that. But yeah, just flagging that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that played into a response from earlier as well. But yeah, thank you. I don't think.
Yeah, I would say though that on thermal efficiency, as I say, I mean that's very much alive. Well, it's much a live issue, but it's something that's moved a long way in recent years, but then in turn has brought with it viability problems. The increase in thickness in walls, the problem in delivering those increased, the new designs of walls with greater thermal efficiency, with delivering dual aspect as well. Dual aspect obviously giving an opportunity to ventilate, reduce overheating. But when you think about it, in a constrained footprint, giving an articulated facade to a building to enable some windows to be at right angles, then combine that with ever-increasing thickness of walls with greater complexity in building those walls, ends up being very expensive. And then you take out more for the lifts as well, which we talked about earlier. We're increasingly left with a diminishing amount of footprint of habitable rooms in the overall gross footprint of a building, and all that has absolutely added to the financial challenges of getting things built and having any money left in the equation for affordable housing.
I was going to come back on viability, but I think it's a separate conversation about who then foots the bill, because obviously it's either the developer or the person who lives there. So I think it's,
that's exactly a point that we've raised. The fact that you see at the moment, this will definitely play out in the consultation. And it's definitely a question we are asking about dual aspect. We're firmly in favour of dual aspect, but it gets raised with us again and again about the fact that it's expensive to deliver, and increasingly so because for the reasons I've outlined, and they're saying, well, we can meet building regs with mechanical ventilation. Well, they should say about other means, but I think broadly they mean mechanical ventilation and air conditioning. Well, that's two problems for us. One, it's the cost to the resident to operate those, but also there's an environmental cost in terms of urban heating, heat island effect. The fact if you've built, several 100,000 homes, all of them pumping out extracted heat and also air conditioning heat, that will have a material environmental impact on the city. So it's absolutely very much a live issue that we're juggling with.
And I don't know if you remember, Deputy Mayor, the threat there was to the Ministry of Sound of the tower block that was proposed next to it. And we had to struggle to keep that institution going, and we did. So that worked. We've kind of come to the end of our questions, but I did want to say, I mean, a lot of your answers are saying that seem to fall back on elements of the London plan not standing up on appeal. Aspirations, not standing up on appeal. And I just wondered whether or not you'll be looking at that and making a more robust plan that we can be more
I absolutely
evidence.
Dispute.
Good job I mentioned it then.
Yeah, no, I absolutely dispute that. I would absolutely deny that was a comment about the last plan. It's about planning policy in general.
I get that, but it's working with that planning policy that you have aspirations in the London plan that seem to have been frustrated by planning policy. Now, I don't know how you can address that with the new revision of the London plan, because obviously when you have a plan, you kind of think that your residents will kind of think that's where you're going, that's what you're going to achieve. But it's a bit like, as you mentioned earlier, the density matrix. If it's a rule that nobody's paying any attention to, then what value is it?
Well, it's not so much, it's not so much, you're taking this a little bit one step further. It's not so much that no one pays attention to it, it's not necessarily enforceable. Because legally in this country, planning decisions are the policies taken as a whole, individual policies not being binary yes or no gateway policies, are not allowed to be so. That means, and then also only so much money being possible in a development, and if they're not meeting the threshold approach, then developments are very finely scrutinised in terms of their viability. And being able to find enough money in a scheme to achieve everything you want a scheme to do, affordable housing, quality, outside play space. If the money is not in the scheme to deliver that, then the law requires the decision maker to make a decision on balance. And obviously all decision makers at all levels are mindful that there's always a tier above that can say, you weren't sufficiently pragmatic in your decision making, you were too absolutist, and then find in favour of the applicant. It's the nature of the system that we work within rather than the failure the failure of the policies not to be strong enough. Because as I say, you can write all the musts you like in a policy, but if they get through the inspector, they're still not necessarily enforceable.
And I think the public will continue to not get that.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. It's a frustration for the public and it's a frustration for policymakers who want to meet the aspiration.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of our questions, and I really appreciated this. And I'm looking forward to more meetings like this as we consider the new plan that's going to be proposed. And
you know me, Chair, I'm always happy to talk about these issues, even when I'm coughing throughout. So thank you for bearing with me.
It's all right. I think you're in what I'm in as well. So I'm in. It's time of the year. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but please feel free to leave.
Thank you, everybody.
And can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme, which also now includes a proposed site visit as part of the planning of tall buildings investigation, which is scheduled for March? Agreed. The London Assembly's annual meeting due to take place in 2025 will decide which committees to establish in the 2025-26 Assembly year and a timetable of the meetings for these committees, which is why we have no date of next meeting. And I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you so much, and thank you to substitutes as well for filling in. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.